wind howled through the ancient oak trees, casting twisted shadows across the weathered headstones of Blackwood Cemetery. It was a place where silence reigned supreme during daylight hours, but when midnight approached, something far more sinister stirred within its forgotten corners. The cemetery had stood for over 2 centuries, a sprawling maze of crumbling monuments and forgotten graves that stretched across nearly 50 acres of cursed ground. Local legends spoke of strange happenings, unexplained disappearances, and lights that danced among the tombstones when the moon was dark. But these were just stories, tales told to frighten children and tourists, or so everyone believed. Thomas Mitchell had been the caretaker of Blackwood Cemetery for nearly 15 years. A man of simple habits and steady nerves, he thought he had seen everything these hallowed grounds could offer. The broken headstones that fell without warning, the overgrown graves where wild animals made their dens, the occasional strange noise that could be explained away by settling earth or scurrying creatures seeking shelter in the darkness. Thomas was a practical man, a man of science and reason. He had grown up in the nearby town of Millbrook, where stories of the haunted cemetery were as common as morning coffee. But Thomas had never believed in ghosts or spirits or things that went bump in the night. Death was simply death, and the dead, well, the dead stayed buried. At least, that's what he had always told himself. But nothing had prepared him for what he would discover on that fateful October night when the veil between worlds grew thin and the ancient secrets of Blackwood Cemetery finally revealed themselves. The evening started like any other in Thomas's carefully ordered routine. As the sun began to set behind the rolling hills that surrounded the cemetery, he made his final rounds of the day. He checked the main gates, secured the maintenance building, and ensured that all the tools were properly stored away. The October air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of dying leaves and the promise of winter's approach. Thomas had always found a certain peace in the evening routine. There was something comforting about the predictability of it all. The same paths walked in the same order, the same tasks completed with methodical precision. It helped to keep his mind occupied, helped him avoid thinking about the loneliness that had settled over his life like a heavy shroud. He had taken the job as caretaker after his wife, Catherine, had passed away 5 years earlier. The cancer had taken her slowly, painfully, and Thomas had watched helplessly as the woman he loved faded away like morning mist. The cottage that came with the caretaker position had seemed like a blessing at the time, a chance to start over, to find purpose in tending to the final resting places of others. But as the years passed, Thomas began to realize that he had simply traded one form of isolation for another. The cemetery was beautiful in its way, peaceful during the day when visitors came to pay their respects to departed loved ones. But when night fell, when the gates were locked and the last mourner had gone home, Thomas was alone with nothing but the silence and the endless rows of stone markers. On this particular evening, as Thomas completed his usual inspection of the grounds, he noticed something that made him pause. In the oldest section of the cemetery, the area locals called the Forgotten Quarter, there seemed to be more shadows than usual. The ancient oak trees that dominated that section appeared to be swaying more vigorously than the gentle evening breeze would warrant, and there was something in the air tension, an electricity that made the hair on Thomas's arms stand on end. The Forgotten Quarter was a place Thomas rarely ventured, even during daylight hours. It was the oldest part of the cemetery, dating back to the early 1800s when the town was first established. Most of the graves in that section were so old that their markers had crumbled or been worn away by decades of harsh weather. The groundskeeping records for that area were incomplete, scattered, and often contradictory. Over the years, Thomas had made several attempts to catalog and map the graves in the Forgotten Quarter, but something always seemed to go wrong. Tools would mysteriously break, paperwork would vanish, and Thomas would find himself feeling increasingly uncomfortable the longer he spent in that shadowy realm among the ancient dead. Eventually, he had simply given up. The Forgotten Quarter was left to nature, a wild tangle of overgrown vegetation and crumbling stone that served as a reminder of mortality's ultimate victory over human ambition and memory. As Thomas finished his evening rounds and returned to his cottage, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about this night. The air seemed thicker somehow, charged with an energy that made his skin crawl and his pulse quicken. He tried to dismiss the sensation as nothing more than the effects of the changing season, but deep down, in the part of his mind that still remembered childhood fears, he knew that something was coming. The cottage itself was a modest affair, built in the 1920s to house the cemetery's caretaker and his family. It sat on a small rise overlooking the main grounds, with windows that provided a clear view of most of the cemetery during daylight hours. Thomas had made few changes to the interior since moving in, keeping Catherine's belongings in their bedroom, maintaining her garden behind the house, living like a man who expected his wife to return at any moment. It was approaching midnight when Thomas first noticed a glow. He had been sitting in his favorite armchair by the living room window, reading a mystery novel and sipping a cup of hot tea, when a strange light caught his attention. At first, he thought it might be car headlights from the road that ran along the cemetery's eastern border, but as he looked more carefully, he realized that the light was coming from within the cemetery grounds. A soft, ethereal radiance flickered between the headstones and the forgotten quarter. The light was unlike anything Thomas had ever seen, neither the harsh glare of electric illumination nor the warm glow of fire. It was something else entirely, something that seemed to pulse with its own mysterious rhythm, something that called to him across the darkness like a beacon in the night. Thomas set down his book and moved closer to the window. The light was definitely moving, drifting slowly between the ancient monuments like a will-o'-the-wisp leading travelers to their doom. As he watched, mesmerized by the hypnotic display, Thomas felt an overwhelming urge to investigate. He tried to resist the impulse. Common sense told him to stay inside, to call the police if he suspected someone was trespassing on cemetery grounds after hours. But the light was so beautiful, so mysteriously alluring, that Thomas found himself reaching for his coat and flashlight almost without conscious thought. The October night was cold when Thomas stepped outside. The wind had picked up since sunset, and the bare branches of the oak trees creaked and groaned like the rigging of a ship in a storm. Clouds scudded across the face of the moon, alternately plunging the cemetery into darkness and bathing it in pale silver light. Thomas made his way along the familiar pathways, his flashlight beam dancing ahead of him as he navigated between the headstones. The mysterious glow was still visible in the distance, pulsing gently like a sleeping heart, drawing him deeper into the forgotten quarter with each step. As he drew closer to the source of the light, Thomas began to feel a change in the atmosphere around him. The air grew thicker, more oppressive, as if he were walking through invisible cobwebs that clung to his skin and clothing. The familiar sounds of the night, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant hoot of an owl, seemed to fade away until all Thomas could hear was the sound of his own breathing and the thundering of his heartbeat in his ears. The light was coming from an area of the forgotten quarter that Thomas had never fully explored. Here, the headstones were older and more elaborate than those in other sections of the cemetery. Massive monuments topped with carved angels and elaborate religious symbols rose from the earth like silent sentinels, their faces worn smooth by time and weather, but still somehow managing to convey a sense of eternal vigilance. And there, standing beside a crumbling headstone covered in thick moss and twisted vines, was the source of the mysterious illumination. An old lantern, ancient beyond measure, glowed with an otherworldly blue-white light that seemed to pulse with its own supernatural heartbeat. Thomas stopped dead in his tracks, his flashlight beam wavering as his hands began to shake. The lantern was like nothing he had ever seen before. The metal appeared to be some sort of tarnished brass or bronze, green with age and covered in strange symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering light. The glass panels were thick and irregular, as if they had been hand-blown by some long-dead craftsman using techniques lost to modern knowledge. But it was the light itself that truly captured Thomas's attention. It wasn't the steady glow of an electric bulb or the dancing flame of a candle. This light seemed to move with purpose, swirling and eddying like water or smoke, creating patterns that were almost, but not quite, recognizable. Sometimes Thomas thought he could see faces in the light, the features of long-dead souls trapped within the lantern's supernatural radiance. The headstone beside the lantern was so weathered that its inscription was barely visible. Thomas approached cautiously, his every instinct screaming at him to turn around and flee back to the safety of his cottage. But curiosity, that fatal human weakness, drove him forward. He knelt down beside the ancient marker and began to brush away the accumulated dirt and debris of decades. Slowly, letter by letter, a name emerged from the stone. Cassandra Blackwood, beloved daughter, 1847 to 1863. She walks among the shadows. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the October air. The name Blackwood was familiar. It was the same as the cemetery itself. But according to all the records Thomas had studied, there were no members of the founding family buried on the grounds. The Blackwood family had sold the land to the town in 1820 and moved west, disappearing into the expanding frontier like so many families of that era. Yet here was evidence that at least one Blackwood had remained behind, buried in the very heart of the cemetery that bore her family's name. As Thomas stared at the inscription, the lantern's glow seemed to intensify. The blue-white light began to pulse faster, more urgently, as if responding to his presence. And then, to Thomas's amazement and terror, the lantern began to move. It lifted slowly from its resting place beside Cassandra Blackwood's grave, rising into the air with the smooth, deliberate motion of something guided by intelligence. The ancient metal showed no signs of rust or corrosion, despite its obvious age, and the strange symbols carved into its surface seemed to glow with their own inner fire. The lantern hovered in the air for a moment, as if studying Thomas with some form of alien awareness. Then, with dreamlike slowness, it began to drift deeper into the forgotten quarter, its hypnotic light casting weird shadows among the ancient monuments. Thomas knew he should return to his cottage immediately. Every rational thought in his mind screamed at him to turn around and forget what he had seen. But something about the lantern's gentle glow was impossible to resist. The light seemed to speak to him on some primal level, promising answers to questions he had never thought to ask, offering solutions to problems he had never fully acknowledged. If you didn't forget, then subscribe to our channel. Against his better judgment, Thomas found himself following the floating lantern deeper into the forgotten quarter. The ancient device led him along pathways he had never seen before, between monuments that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. The very geography of the cemetery seemed to be rearranging itself, creating new routes through the maze of stone and shadow. As they walked, Thomas began to hear whispers carried on the night wind, soft voices speaking words and languages he didn't recognize, tongues that had perhaps been dead for centuries. The voices seemed to be coming from the graves themselves, as if the long-dead residents were stirring in their eternal rest, awakening to witness the midnight procession. The lantern paused beside another headstone, this one in slightly better condition than Cassandra's marker. The inscription was clearly visible in the supernatural glow. Margaret Ashworth, loving wife and mother, 1823 to 1845. The light calls her home. Thomas felt his hands begin to tremble as he read the words. Another grave he had never seen before, another inscription that seemed to reference some kind of mysterious light. The date of death was decades before Cassandra Blackwood's, yet both women had apparently been drawn to the same supernatural phenomenon. The lantern continued its journey, and Thomas continued to follow, drawn forward by a compulsion he could neither understand nor resist. They passed through sections of the forgotten quarter that defied his knowledge of the cemetery's layout. Here were monuments he had never catalogued, mausoleums he had never explored, entire rows of graves that seemed to exist in some parallel version of the grounds he had tended for 15 years. Each time the lantern paused, it was beside another headstone bearing a woman's name and a cryptic inscription that filled Thomas with growing dread. Elizabeth Thornfield, devoted daughter, 1834 to 1856. She answered the call. Charlotte Morrison, beloved sister, 1829 to 1847. The lantern showed her the way. Victoria Hartwell, faithful servant, 1841 to 1859. She walks with the light. Penelope Crawford, cherished friend, 1838 to 1854. The darkness claimed her not. The deeper they went into the forgotten quarter, the more graves appeared. Dozens of them, scores of them, all bearing the names of young women, all with death dates spanning the past 180 years. The inscriptions followed similar themes, speaking of light and calling and walking with forces that should not exist in the world of the living. Thomas began to notice other disturbing patterns as well. Many of the women had died young, most in their teens or 20s, and their death dates seemed to cluster around certain times of the year. October was heavily represented, as was the time around the winter solstice and the dark nights of the new moon. The whispers grew louder as Thomas followed the lantern deeper into this nightmarish realm. The voices became clearer, more distinct, and Thomas realized with growing horror that they were all female voices, young women calling out in languages from different eras and different countries. Some spoke in archaic English that reminded Thomas of Shakespeare's plays. Others used what sounded like French or German or Italian, but with accents and pronunciations that suggested these were not modern speakers, but women who had learned these languages decades or centuries ago. Still others used tongues that Thomas couldn't identify at all, languages that might have been spoken by the native peoples who had lived in this region before European settlement, or perhaps something even older and more mysterious. "Follow the light," whispered a voice that might have belonged to a young Victorian lady. "Venez avec nous," called another in what sounded like ancient French. "Come to us, join our eternal dance," pleaded a third in accented English. "Das Licht auf dich," echoed a fourth in what might have been German. The voices seemed to be coming from all directions at once, from the graves, from the trees, from the very air around Thomas. They spoke in unison sometimes, creating a chorus of the damned that made his skin crawl and his soul recoil in terror. Other times they called out individually, each voice telling its own story of being drawn to the mysterious light, of following its call into the darkness, of joining some sort of supernatural sisterhood that transcended death itself. Thomas tried to stop following the lantern. He tried to turn back toward his cottage and the familiar world of the living, but his feet seemed to move of their own accord, drawn forward by some irresistible force that was stronger than his conscious will. The lantern's hypnotic glow had captured not just his attention, but his very soul, binding him to its purpose with chains stronger than iron. As they ventured deeper into the forgotten quarter, Thomas began to notice that the landscape around him was changing in ways that defied natural law. The trees grew larger and more twisted, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers to brush against his face and snag at his clothing. The ground beneath his feet became softer, more yielding, as if he were walking not on solid earth, but on something organic and alive. The headstones themselves seemed to be growing taller, more elaborate, more threatening. What had started as simple markers carved from local stone had transformed into massive monuments that towered over Thomas like ancient giants. The carved figures atop these monuments, angels and cherubs and religious symbols, seemed to turn their stone heads to watch his passage, their eyes following him with expressions of pity, or perhaps hunger. The lantern led him past mausoleums that hadn't existed moments before, past crypts with doors that stood slightly ajar, past burial plots that seemed to extend far deeper into the earth than any normal grave should go. The supernatural light illuminated details that Thomas's rational mind refused to accept, stone coffins that showed evidence of being clawed open from within, burial shrouds that moved with no wind to stir them, shadows that fell in directions that had nothing to do with the position of the moon. And still the whispers continued, growing more urgent, more insistent, more seductive with each step Thomas took into this realm of the damned. "Join us," they seemed to say. "Take your place among the chosen. The light will set you free," promised another voice. "No more loneliness, no more pain," whispered a third. "Catherine is waiting," called a voice that made Thomas's blood freeze in his veins. That last whisper, spoken in a tone and accent that was hauntingly familiar, nearly broke Thomas's remaining resolve. It sounded like it couldn't be, but it sounded exactly like his deceased wife calling to him from beyond the grave. The voice carried all the warmth and love he remembered, all the comfort he had lost when cancer took her away, all the promises of reunion that he had dreamed of during his darkest nights. "Catherine," Thomas whispered into the darkness, his voice barely audible above the supernatural chorus. "I'm here," came the reply, soft and loving, and filled with the kind of peace Thomas had been searching for since the day she died. "Follow the light. Come to me. We can be together forever." The lantern seemed to pulse brighter at these words, its blue-white radiance expanding to illuminate a wider area of the forgotten quarter. And in that expanded glow, Thomas saw something that made his heart nearly stop with joy and terror in equal measure. Standing among the headstones was a familiar figure, a woman in a white dress who looked exactly like Catherine had on their wedding day 30 years earlier. Her face was radiant with the same loving smile that had captivated Thomas when they first met. Her eyes sparkled with the same warmth and intelligence he had fallen in love with all those years ago. "Catherine," Thomas called out, taking a step toward the apparition. "Is it really you?" The figure smiled and beckoned to him, her lips moving in words Thomas couldn't quite hear over the whispers of the other voices. She looked exactly as she had when she was young and healthy, before the cancer had ravaged her body and stolen her strength. This was Catherine as Thomas preferred to remember her, beautiful and vibrant and full of life. But as Thomas moved closer to the ghostly figure, he began to notice details that filled him with growing unease. Catherine's skin had a pale luminescence that matched the lantern's glow. Her eyes reflected light like those of an animal caught in headlights, and when she moved, she seemed to glide rather than walk, as if her feet never quite touched the ground. "Come closer," she whispered, her voice carrying on the wind despite the distance between them. "Don't be afraid. Death is not the end. It's just the beginning of our real life together." Thomas wanted to believe her, wanted to accept that somehow his beloved wife had returned from beyond the grave to offer him the reunion he had prayed for every night since her death. But something deep in his mind, some primitive survival instinct that had served humanity since the dawn of time, was screaming warnings that this was not his Catherine, that this was something else entirely, wearing her beloved face like a mask. The lantern came to rest beside a massive oak tree in the very heart of the forgotten quarter. The ancient tree was larger than any Thomas had ever seen, its trunk so wide that a dozen men holding hands could not have encircled it, its branches spreading out like the arms of some titanic god to create a natural cathedral of wood and shadow. At the base of the tree was a perfect circle of headstones, 12 monuments arranged with mathematical precision around the ancient trunk. Each headstone was identical in size and shape, each carved from the same type of dark stone, each bearing the name and dates of a young woman who had died between 1820 and the present day. But it was what lay in the center of the circle that truly captured Thomas's horrified attention. An open grave, freshly dug, with rich black earth piled beside the rectangular hole like an offering to whatever dark powers held sway in this cursed place. The grave was deep, far deeper than any normal burial site. The bottom disappeared into inky blackness that seemed to extend far beyond the reach of even the lantern's supernatural illumination. As Thomas stared into the void, he thought he could see movement in the depths, shadows within shadows that suggested something vast and ancient stirring in the darkness below. "Welcome home," whispered the voice that sounded like Catherine, and Thomas turned to see that the apparition had moved closer while he was examining the grave. She was now standing just outside the circle of headstones, her pale face glowing with otherworldly radiance, her eyes fixed on Thomas with an expression of infinite love and infinite hunger. "This is your place," she continued, gesturing toward the open grave. "Your final resting place, where we can be together forever in the eternal light." Thomas tried to scream, but no sound emerged from his throat. He tried to run, but his legs would not obey his commands. The lantern's hypnotic glow held him captive, paralyzed by forces beyond his understanding or control. He could only watch in mute terror as the truth of his situation became horrifyingly clear. Around the circle of headstones, other figures began to appear. Dozens of pale women in clothing from different historical periods, all glowing with the same supernatural radiance as the false Catherine, all staring at Thomas with expressions of terrible expectation. Some wore the elaborate gowns of Victorian ladies, others the simpler dresses of servants and working women from bygone eras. Still others wore more modern clothing that suggested they had been claimed by the lantern's call in recent decades. But all of them shared the same otherworldly beauty, the same luminous skin, the same eyes that reflected light like polished glass. And all of them were young, forever frozen at the age when death had claimed them, forever beautiful in their supernatural preservation. "We've been waiting for you," whispered a woman in an 1890s dress. "Waiting so long," added another in what appeared to be 1920s fashion. "You're the last piece," said a third who might have died in the 1960s based on her clothing and hairstyle. "The final sacrifice," concluded a fourth whose modern attire suggested she had been claimed within the last few years. Thomas realized with growing horror that he was looking at all the women whose graves he had passed during his journey through the Forgotten Quarter. They were not truly dead, not in any conventional sense. Instead, they had been transformed into something else, servants or disciples of whatever ancient power dwelt beneath the cemetery, guardians of secrets that predated human civilization. The whispers rose to a crescendo now, no longer the gentle murmuring of wind through leaves, but a full-throated chorus of the damned. The voices of dozens of women, all calling to Thomas, all urging him to take that final step into the waiting grave, all promising him peace and reunion, and an end to the loneliness that had consumed his life since Catherine's death. But beneath their seductive words, Thomas could hear something else, a note of desperation, of hunger, of need that had nothing to do with love or comfort or eternal rest. These creatures, whatever they were, needed him for some purpose that he could not comprehend, some dark ritual that required his willing participation, some ancient ceremony that would not be complete until he joined their supernatural sisterhood. The false Catherine moved closer still, close enough now that Thomas could see the terrible truth behind her beautiful facade. Her skin was not merely pale but translucent, revealing a network of dark veins that pulsed with the same rhythm as the lantern's glow. Her eyes, while still beautiful, held no warmth, no recognition of the man she had once loved, only an endless hunger that could never be satisfied. "Don't be afraid," she whispered, reaching out to touch Thomas's face with fingers that felt like ice. "Death is just a doorway, and on the other side, we can be together forever." Thomas wanted to believe her, wanted to accept that this nightmare was somehow a twisted form of blessing, that by joining these supernatural beings, he could indeed be reunited with the woman he had loved more than life itself. But as her cold fingers traced the lines of his face, as her hollow eyes stared into his soul, Thomas knew with absolute certainty that whatever this creature was, it was not his Catherine, and whatever it was offering him was not the reunion he had dreamed of, but something far more sinister. The lantern floated directly over the open grave now, its light pulsing faster and faster until it seemed to beat in rhythm with Thomas's terrified heart. The strange symbols carved into its ancient metal glowed with increasing intensity, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly but were impossible to ignore. And then, from the depths of the grave, came a sound that chilled Thomas's blood and made his sanity totter on the edge of collapse. Something was climbing up from the bottom of the shaft, something ancient and vast and utterly alien to the human experience. Thomas could hear it moving in the darkness below, a wet sliding sound like a massive serpent dragging itself across stone, accompanied by other noises that his mind refused to categorize, clicking and chittering, and sounds that might have been laughter if laughter could be stripped of all joy and humanity. The ghostly women around the circle began to sway in unison, their movements synchronized like dancers following some unholy choreography. They raised their arms toward the floating lantern, their faces turned upward in expressions of worship and anticipation, their voices joining together in a chant that used no language Thomas had ever heard, but that somehow conveyed meaning directly to his consciousness. They were calling to something, summoning something, preparing for the arrival of whatever dark deity or ancient horror made its home in the depths beneath Blackwood Cemetery. Thomas felt his foot slide forward, despite his desperate attempts to remain still. The crumbling edge of the grave began to give way beneath his weight, loose earth cascading into the darkness below with soft pattering sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the supernatural silence. He looked down into the infinite blackness of the shaft and saw that the thing climbing toward him was almost at the surface. It had too many arms, too many eyes, limbs that bent in ways that violated the laws of anatomy and physics. Its skin, if it could be called skin, was the color of old parchment and seemed to shift and flow like liquid while maintaining a solid form. The eyes, dozens of them scattered across its grotesque form, burned with the same blue-white fire as the lantern, and they were all fixed on Thomas with an intelligence that was older than human civilization, hungrier than any earthly predator. This was the source of the lantern's power, the dark god or primordial demon that had been claiming victims for centuries, feeding on their life force, their souls, their very essence. The women around the circle were not its servants, but its cattle, beautiful vessels preserved in supernatural amber to serve its needs until the end of time. And now it wanted Thomas to join them, to become part of its eternal harvest, to feed its insatiable hunger with his own life and soul. The creature reached up from the depths with arms that seemed to stretch like rubber, grasping for Thomas with claws that could rend steel like paper. The ghostly women's chanting reached a fever pitch, their voices blending into a cacophony of worship and madness that seemed to shake the very foundations of reality. Thomas tried one last time to flee, gathering every ounce of willpower he possessed, fighting against the hypnotic influence of the lantern with all his remaining strength. For a moment, just a moment, he thought he might break free, might escape this nightmare and return to the world of the living. But then the false Catherine was beside him, her cold arms wrapping around his waist, her lips pressed against his ear as she whispered words that destroyed his last hope of escape. "It's time," she breathed. "Time to join us, time to be together forever, time to feed the eternal hunger." Thomas felt himself falling, tumbling into the waiting grave, into the arms of the ancient horror that had been claiming souls for longer than human memory. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him was the lantern's blue-white glow, pulsing triumphantly as it added another victim to its centuries-long harvest. The creature in the depths welcomed him with terrible joy, its alien consciousness flooding into his mind, showing him visions of all the others who had come before, all the caretakers and visitors and innocent souls who had answered the lantern's call over the decades. He saw William Hayes, who had tended the cemetery in the 1890s, lured to his doom by the promise of reunion with his son, who had died in infancy. He saw Robert Chun, a groundskeeper from the 1920s, drawn to the forgotten quarter by dreams of his lost love. He saw Patricia Volkov, a night security guard from the 1970s, who had followed the lantern's glow thinking she could solve the mystery of the missing persons reports that had plagued the area for generations. All of them had made the same choice, had followed the same seductive light, had ended up in the same terrible place, feeding the same ancient hunger that could never be satisfied. And now Thomas was part of that endless cycle, his consciousness absorbed into the creature's collective memory, his life force added to its supernatural power, his soul trapped forever in service to its dark purpose. But the nightmare was not over, would never be over. Even as Thomas's individual identity dissolved into the creature's alien essence, even as his memories became part of its vast collection of stolen experiences, the lantern continued to glow above the now empty grave. For there was always someone new to claim, always another lonely soul who could be lured by promises of reunion and comfort, always another victim who could be added to the eternal harvest. When the morning sun rose over Blackwood Cemetery, painting the ancient headstones in shades of gold and crimson, there was no trace of Thomas Mitchell. His cottage stood empty, his belongings undisturbed, his final cup of tea still sitting cold and forgotten on the table beside his favorite chair. The police would eventually investigate, would file reports about another missing person, would add Thomas's name to the long list of individuals who had mysteriously vanished in the vicinity of the old cemetery. But they would find no clues, no evidence of foul play, no indication of where the longtime caretaker had gone or why he had disappeared. The only change in the forgotten quarter was a freshly carved headstone that appeared overnight among the other monuments to the vanished. The inscription was simple, elegant, and terrifying in its implications. Thomas Mitchell, faithful caretaker, 1978 to 2024. He answered the lantern's call. Within days, a new caretaker was hired. David Ashford, a recent widower looking for a quiet job where he could grieve in peace, moved into the cottage and began tending the grounds with the same dedication Thomas had shown. He was a good man, a kind man, a man who loved his late wife Jennifer with the same devotion Thomas had felt for Catherine. And when the next new moon arrived, when the ancient powers stirred once again in the depths beneath the cemetery, David would see a mysterious glow in the forgotten quarter, and the cycle would begin anew. The last lantern continues to burn in Blackwood Cemetery, calling out to those who are lost, those who are lonely, those who are desperate enough to believe in impossible promises of reunion with the dead. It waits patiently in the shadows, patient as only something eternal can be, ready to add new names to its growing collection, new souls to its insatiable appetite. But remember this warning, dear listener. If you ever find yourself walking through an old cemetery after dark, and you see a strange glow among the headstones, a light that pulses with unnatural rhythm, a beacon that seems to call your name with voices of the dead, turn around immediately and walk away. Do not follow the light, no matter how beautiful it appears, no matter how seductive its promises, no matter how desperately you want to believe that death is not the end and that love can conquer the grave. For some lights are not meant to guide you home, but to lead you to a place from which there is no return, a place where ancient hungers wait to feast on human souls, a place where the dead do not rest, but serve darker masters than the grave. The lantern still glows in Blackwood Cemetery, and it will continue to glow until the end of time, or until it has claimed every lonely soul in the world. The choice, as always, is yours, but choose wisely, for in the forgotten quarter of Blackwood Cemetery some mistakes can never be undone. The ancient cemetery of Ravens Hollow had stood for over 3 centuries, its weathered gates creaking with secrets that should never be told. Local townspeople avoided the place after sunset, but some visitors found themselves drawn there by forces beyond their understanding. Dr. Harrison Mitchell, a renowned archaeologist from Oxford, had come to this remote Canadian town with his research team. They were investigating reports of unusual electromagnetic readings beneath the graveyard. What they would discover would challenge everything they believed about life and death. The team consisted of 5 members. Harrison led the group with his decades of experience. James Peterson, a young geologist from Toronto, handled the ground-penetrating radar equipment. Dr. Catherine Walsh from Dublin specialized in historical documentation. Thomas Anderson, their electronics expert from Melbourne, monitored the strange energy signatures. Finally, Marie Dubois from Paris served as their translator for the old French inscriptions found throughout the cemetery. As autumn fog rolled across the graveyard that October evening, the team set up their equipment among the tilting headstones. The air felt heavy, almost alive with anticipation. "The readings are off the charts tonight," Thomas announced, adjusting his instruments. His Australian accent carried a note of excitement mixed with unease. Catherine examined a particularly old tombstone, its French inscription barely visible. "This grave dates back to 1687, she called out. "But something's not right about the carving. It looks like it was done from the inside." James positioned the ground-penetrating radar near the oldest section of the cemetery. The device immediately began detecting hollow spaces beneath multiple graves. "Professor Mitchell," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "you need to see this. There are chambers down there, interconnected tunnels running beneath the entire graveyard." Harrison approached the radar display, his face growing pale in the green glow. "That's impossible. This cemetery was built on solid bedrock." Marie had been translating the French inscriptions when she stumbled backward in shock. "Mon Dieu, these aren't burial records. They're warnings. Each inscription is telling people to stay away, to never dig, to never listen to the voices." As if responding to her words, a low humming began to emanate from the ground beneath their feet. The sound was barely audible at first, like a distant conversation carried on the wind. "Do you hear that?" James whispered, kneeling beside his equipment. The humming grew stronger, and within it they could distinguish individual voices. Men, women, children, all speaking in different languages, different accents. But they were all saying the same thing. Names. The voices were calling out names. James, came a whisper from below. James Peterson. The young geologist's face went white. That's my name. But how could they know? Catherine Walsh. Another voice called from beneath the moss-covered stones. Come closer, Catherine. Dr. Walsh stumbled backward, her historical documents scattering in the wind. This is impossible. We've never been here before. No one in this town knows us. Thomas's electronic equipment began malfunctioning, screens flickering with static. Through the interference, more voices emerged from the speakers. Thomas Anderson, we've been waiting for you. Marie Dubois, rejoin us, Marie. Harrison Mitchell, you found what you were looking for. The fog around them thickened impossibly, despite the lack of wind. Harrison tried to maintain his scientific composure, but his hands shook as he reached for his radio. Base camp, this is Mitchell. We need immediate extraction. Only static responded. The voices grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from directly beneath each team member's feet. James pointed his flashlight downward and gasped. The ground around his boots was moving, shifting like liquid earth. The soil, it's not solid, he whispered. Professor, I think we're standing on something hollow. Catherine grabbed Harrison's arm. Look at the headstones. The dates, they're changing. Indeed, the carved dates were shifting before their eyes. Graves marked 1687, now read 1987. Others showed dates that hadn't arrived yet, future dates that included their own names. Harrison Mitchell, died October 31st, appeared on the nearest tombstone. This can't be real, Thomas muttered, backing away from his equipment. But as he moved, the ground beneath him began to give way, not collapsing, but softening like wet clay. Marie screamed as her feet began to sink into what should have been solid earth. The ground, it's pulling me down. One by one, each team member found themselves slowly sinking. The voices from below grew clearer, more welcoming. Join us, they called. We've been so lonely, so very lonely. Harrison realized with growing horror that the voices weren't coming from corpses. They were coming from people who had been pulled down here while still alive. People who had been drawn to this place over the centuries. People whose names had been called from the darkness below. The electromagnetic readings, he gasped as the soil reached his knees. They weren't from natural sources. They were from the trapped. All those people still alive down there, calling for help, calling for others to join them. James's geological equipment finally provided the terrible answer as he sank deeper. The tunnels, they're not empty. The radar shows movement. Lots of movement. There are hundreds of people down there, maybe thousands. Catherine's research suddenly made horrifying sense. The warnings on the tombstones, they weren't about the dead. They were about the living. People who came here and never left. People who were pulled into those chambers and kept alive somehow. The voices grew more urgent as the team sank deeper into the earth. Don't fight it. It's easier if you don't fight. You'll understand once you're down here with us. Time works differently underground, you'll see. Thomas's equipment registered one final reading before the soil claimed it. The temperature beneath the cemetery was far too warm for October in Canada. Whatever was down there was generating heat, sustaining life in ways that defied explanation. As Marie disappeared completely into the ground, her muffled voice could still be heard. The inscription I translated, it said this place was built on a crack in the world, a place where the rules don't apply. Harrison fought against the pulling earth with his last breath of surface air. The townspeople, they know. That's why they avoid this place. But they let visitors come here because it keeps the voices satisfied, keeps them from calling out to the locals. James was the last to speak before the ground claimed him entirely. Professor, my equipment, it detected a pattern. Every 30 years, the activity peaks. Every 30 years, they need new voices to add to their chorus. The cemetery fell silent. The fog lifted. The ground returned to normal, showing no signs of disturbance. But deep beneath the weathered tombstones, 5 new voices had joined the eternal chorus. Soon, they too would learn to call out names to unsuspecting visitors. And somewhere in the tunnels below, Dr. Harrison Mitchell's voice could be heard learning the words that would draw the next group of victims. "Hello, can you hear us? We've been waiting for you. We know your names." The ancient cemetery of Ravens Hollow maintained its silence during the day. But as night fell, careful listeners might hear something new among the whispers beneath the tombstones. Voices with Canadian accents, Irish brogues, Australian drawls, French intonations, and proper British pronunciations, all calling out into the darkness above, all waiting for someone new to answer. The townspeople of Ravens Hollow checked their records the next morning. 5 rental cars abandoned outside the cemetery. 5 missing persons reports that would never be filed. 5 more names that would never be spoken aloud near the graveyard again. Because in Ravens Hollow, everyone knew the rule that kept them safe. Never go to the cemetery after dark. Never listen to the voices calling your name. And never, ever, acknowledge that you can hear the whispers beneath the tombstones. The cycle would continue, as it had for 3 centuries. The voices would call, visitors would answer, and the darkness beneath Ravens Hollow would grow stronger with each soul added to its eternal collection. In the underground chambers, the newest additions to the chorus were learning their purpose. They were learning to call out to the living world above, and they were learning that some hungers can never be satisfied, only shared. The old-timers in Ravenhill always said, "Never go near that gate after midnight." For 200 years, the rusted iron barrier had stood sealed, keeping something terrible locked away. But tonight, the storm would change everything. Professor William Montgomery stepped into the hammering rain at Ravenhill Cemetery. Thunder roared as lightning illuminated Gothic spires, piercing the dark sky. "This is mental," muttered his assistant Oliver. "Why at night?" William's eyes gleamed with obsession. For months, he'd studied the gate locals whispered about, sealed since 1823, with strange carved symbols. Dr. Catherine from Edinburgh and historian James joined them. They found the 10-foot iron gate twisted into patterns that seemed to shift in their flashlight beams. Symbols carved deep into metal hurt to look at directly. But tonight was different. The gate was moving slightly, as if something pushed from the other side. "Impossible," James breathed. "The chains are intact." Lightning crashed. In that flash, they saw clearly. The gate stood open. Ancient chains lay broken on the ground. Beyond lay not more cemetery, but impenetrable darkness that swallowed their light. Cold air drifted through, smelling of earth undisturbed for centuries. The carved symbols pulsed with sickly green light, like a heartbeat. Footsteps echoed from the darkness, slow, deliberate, then breathing, ragged gasps from lungs that hadn't worked in decades. Lightning revealed him, a gaunt figure in rotted clothing, skin like parchment over bone, empty black eye sockets. His smile made Oliver scream, rotted lips showing teeth far too long and sharp. After so very long, it spoke like scraping leaves. "Visitors. How delightful." "Run," William gasped. They scattered. Behind them, inhuman laughter echoed. Oliver fell, scrambling as the thing followed with deliberate steps that somehow matched his sprint. His scream cut through the storm, then silence. Catherine hid as dozens of undead filled the area, led by the creature organizing them with terrible intelligence. A cold hand touched her shoulder. Going somewhere? Something that had once been a woman, now bone and tattered dress, smiled at her. James reached his car to find Oliver approaching, head unnaturally tilted, black liquid from his mouth, eyes completely black. "Don't leave us, James," Oliver called. James escaped to the police station, but the officer dismissed his story. Every few months, same tale. Nothing there but graves. Morning came. At the cemetery, everything looked normal. Where the gate should be, just old fence, rusted but intact. "This barrier's been here decades," the officer said. "But my friends..." James started. "What friends?" The memories slipped away like water. Weeks passed. James found no records of his companions, as if they'd never existed. Haunted by dreams, he returned one night with a shovel. 3 feet down, a piece of black iron with twisted symbols. Touching it brought the memories flooding back, and something else the creatures offer. Join willingly and keep your memories. Resist and become empty shells. He was the only one who'd run. Around the cemetery walked familiar figures. Oliver with tilted head, Catherine by the mausoleum, William leading them with black pit eyes. "Hello, James," William called. "We've missed you." Trapped between locked gates, James faced his transformed friends. "This town sits on a doorway," Catherine explained. "The gate kept the living out, not the dead in." "Join us." William stood inches away. "Just take my hand." As James touched William's cold skin, understanding flooded him. The doorway was open after 2 centuries. His consciousness faded as something else took control. Last thought, they weren't the first researchers, and wouldn't be the last. More would come. More curious academics and ghost hunters. And James would be waiting. The gate wasn't meant to keep the dead in. It was meant to let them out. Dawn revealed 4 new graves with the same inscription. "Here lies a seeker of truth." Beneath each headstone, something waited for the next storm, the next researchers, the next opening. In Ravenhill, death is just the beginning.